Welcome to the Silicon Fox podcast, where we explore the habits and stories of high performers. Join us as we dive into their journeys, analyze live blood tests, and break down the science behind key biomarkers to help you optimize your health. I'm your host, Mitchell Eschner, an ex-pro soccer player, a current sponsored hybrid athlete, a health tech founder, and a longevity enthusiast. Today, we're looking into a critical biomarker for metabolic health, HbA1c. You might have heard about this in the context of diabetes, but its implications go far beyond that. In today's episode, we're going to break down what HbA1c really measures, how glucose and insulin work together in the body, and why understanding insulin sensitivity and resistance is crucial for interpreting your HbA1c results. We'll also discuss why so many of us have hormone levels out of sync and what we can do about it. Now, to really understand this biomarker and what we're testing for, we first need to do a little biology lesson. Let's start with the basics. Glucose and insulin. Glucose is essentially the body's primary source of energy. Every time you eat food, especially carbohydrates, your digestive system breaks it down into glucose. This glucose then gets released into the bloodstream where it's set to go into cells for fuel. This is the key for everything, from powering your brain to fueling your muscles. Now, glucose can't just be absorbed into your cells. That's where insulin comes in. Insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas. Think of it like a key. It unlocks the door to your cells that glucose can get inside. Insulin then binds to receptors in the cell surface, triggering a signal that causes glucose transporter proteins to move to the cell membrane. This in turn allows glucose to pass through into the cell via these proteins. So effectively, we digest food, it's processed into glucose, and insulin helps glucose find its way into our cells to then be used for fuel. Now, there's a term known as insulin sensitivity. When we say someone is insulin sensitive, it means their cells respond efficiently to insulin. In other words, their cells unlock easily when insulin shows up, allowing glucose to flow in and then be used for energy. This is precisely what we want. Now, on the flip side, what we have is known as insulin resistance. This happens when the cells don't respond as well to insulin, making it harder to get glucose into your cells. Now, over time, your body compensates by producing more and more insulin, but eventually it just cannot keep up. As a result, glucose builds up in your bloodstream, leading to higher blood sugar levels, which is often a key driver for type 2 diabetes. So now, how does HbA1c test for this is a great question. As glucose builds up in your bloodstream, it starts sticking to hemoglobin in a process known as glycation. The HbA1c test measures the amount of glycated hemoglobin in the blood over the past 2 to 3 months. Now, the reason why it's 2 to 3 months is because that's the lifespan of red blood cells. If someone has developed a resistance to insulin, their blood sugar will be higher, meaning there will be a higher concentration of glycated hemoglobin. This will show up as a higher level of HbA1c, giving a clear indication that your blood sugar control is off. Now, understanding whether you're insulin sensitive or insulin resistant helps make sense of why your HbA1c levels might be higher than they should be. It helps guide treatment, whether that's lifestyle changes, medication, or sometimes both. So now we've talked a little bit about insulin, but glucose regulation is actually controlled by a network of hormones. These include cortisol, often called the stress hormone. Now, here's the problem. Modern lifestyles tend to throw these hormones out of balance. Your body releases more cortisol under constant stress. One of cortisol's jobs is to raise your blood sugar so you have more energy to deal with whatever's stressing you out. Now, if you're always stressed, you're constantly pumping out cortisol, which keeps your blood sugar elevated. This can contribute to insulin resistance over time. Now, another major factor is poor sleep. Studies show that even a few nights of bad sleep can make you more and more insulin resistant. And then there's diet. Processed foods, especially those in high in refined sugars and unhealthy fats, can mess with the body's ability to regulate insulin properly. It's a perfect storm for throwing your hormones and blood sugar levels out of sync. Now, this is why many people, even those without diagnosed diabetes, can have elevated HbA1c levels or borderline insulin resistance without even realizing it. And why managing stress, sleep, and diet can have such a profound impact on your metabolic health. Now, let's talk a little bit about why it's so crucial for monitoring your overall health beyond just diabetes. Most people think of HbA1c tests strictly as a tool for diagnosing and managing diabetes, but the reality is it's one of the best markers we have for understanding your metabolic health in general. Let me explain what I mean by that. Metabolic health is essentially how well your body is processing and managing the energy you're taking in, primarily through carbohydrates. Glucose metabolism is set to meet cell energy demands. If this homeostasis is dysregulated, it can lead to a variety of healthcare complications. Central obesity, dyslipidemia, which is also known as an abnormal level of lipids in the blood, and hypertension, predisposing individuals to cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. HbA1c levels give us insight into how efficiently your body is handling glucose over the long term. This can be an early warning sign, even before these medical conditions develop. If your HbA1c is creeping up into the pre-diabetic range, that's your body telling you that your metabolism is struggling with the blood sugar control. It's often a wake-up call. So now, who should actually be getting this test? Obviously, if you've been diagnosed with diabetes, You're likely already familiar with the HbA1c test. Your doctor uses it to monitor how well your treatment is managing your blood sugar over time. But there are other groups who should consider getting regularly tested. Now, for instance, if you've been told that you're at risk for having pre-diabetic, or if you're at risk of developing diabetes due to factors like family history, being overweight, or leading a sedentary lifestyle, regular HbA1c testing is a great tool to track your blood sugar trends over time. In fact, the CDC estimates that more than 88 million adults in the US have prediabetes, and many of them don't even know it. Now, in my case, I have a family history of type 2 diabetes, going back multiple generations, so I make it a point to monitor my HbA1c levels. Even though I eat well and train as a hybrid athlete, running a few marathons, lifting 6 to 7 times a week, and Ironman training with some cycling and swimming, I still make sure that these levels are in check as part of staying proactive about my health. But it's not just about diabetes. Anyone who's interested in tracking their metabolic health or noticing early warning signs of insulin resistance could benefit. That includes athletes or individuals interested in optimizing their health, particularly if they're noticing changes in energy levels, mood, or performance. I had recently actually read a study where researchers looked at glycemic control in a group of elite professional cyclists and then compared those results to those of sedentary individuals. The athletes contributed blood samples to those studied during the competitive season. It's also worth mentioning that due to the region where the study took place, both groups followed Mediterranean diets. While the fasting plasma glucose levels remained lower in the athletes compared to the non-athletes, the study found that HbA1c levels were elevated, even though they were not at risk for diabetes. Now, on the screen right now is a distribution of glycated hemoglobin values between healthy sedentary individual controls and athletes, classified according to their different intensities of physical aerobic exercise, that is, elite or pro cyclists. Now, the central horizontal line at each group is the mean value of HbA1c. As you may be able to see from the distribution, the HbA1c levels for the pro cyclist is in fact slightly higher than the group of sedentary control. When I say slightly, I do of course mean that there's a statistical significance between the levels of glycated hemoglobin between the two groups. While the tests were still in the normal classification level, meaning neither group was in the pre-diabetic level, it's still fascinating to see how these athletes showed to have higher blood sugar despite their seemingly strict exercise regimes. Now, the study went on to propose a few multiple explanations for this. First, we know that during intense training, athletes consume large amounts of carbohydrates to fuel their performance. These high carb intakes, especially during and immediately after training, can lead to periodic spikes in blood sugar, which might drive the slight increase in HbA1c. Secondly, the intensity of exercise itself triggers a number of hormonal changes. For example, when athletes train near their lactate threshold, their bodies release catecholamines like adrenaline, which can temporarily elevate blood glucose to meet the energy demands of exercise. This combination of high carb intake and glucose release during intense training might explain why we see these higher HbA1c levels. While these aren't necessarily bad outcomes, the important emphasis here is that body adapts to demands of high performance exercise. Athletes looking to optimize their performance need to understand these critical biomarkers in order to individualize their training and produce the best possible results. Now, we all know that athletes need carbs for performance, but being mindful of when and how much is consumed can help manage long-term blood glucose levels, as periodic sugar spikes from high carb diets during training might contribute to these elevated HbA1c levels. So now to wrap up, the HbA1c test gives us a valuable window into how your long-term blood sugar levels, given it's tightly linked to how well your body is handling glucose and insulin. If you're insulin resistant or if your hormones are out of sync because of stress, poor sleep, or diet, your HbA1c is likely to rise. The good news is that by understanding these factors and making targeted changes, you can lower your HbA1c and reduce your risk of metabolic disease. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you've gained some insight in how these hormones and biomarkers fit together. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe, share it with others who might benefit, and as always, I encourage you to take charge of your health by staying informed and being proactive about your body's signals. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the SciFox Health Podcast.